Caliente pito.
I want to tell you a story. Acapulco's very beautiful. I want to tell you a story. Acapulco's very beautiful. With this woman so pretty, and the beaches are so wonderful. With this beaches so pretty, and the beaches are so wonderful. Hey, oh, come on, baby, let's go to Acapulco. With Colombian power, baby. I want to tell you a story. Acapulco is very beautiful. I want to tell you a story. Acapulco is very beautiful. With its beaches so pretty, and the sea is also wonderful. With its beaches so pretty, and the sea is also wonderful. Where the rich people go, and the sun's always shining. To have fun in the water, and just wonderful lovers. Where the rich people
What is up,
go,
everyone? Ooh,
and the sun's always shining.
Lights. There we go. All right, welcome in, everyone. I'm getting everything set up. I'm getting everything set up right now. But yeah.
To my Acapulco, with all my love.
I don't know about Acapulco. Isn't that a big drug place? Okay. We'll leave this in the background for a little bit. We got some homework to do and a lot of reading for Conroy's class. All right, so shout out to Hassan wearing a shirt today. And he was just featured in issue 61 of JACOBIN magazine. Hold on. And I wanted to read that with everyone because I think that would be fun. Because we love Hassan. There we go. See, freaking hilarious. Hassan Piker Moggs the Capitalist. We're just gonna keep that on screen right now. Shout out to homie Hassan. Alright. That's enough of that music. Y'all can hear me good. Everything is good. Let me get the other doc up. Five, thank you. All right, cool. Oh, let me just do. Okay. Stupid. I'm sorry, I just can't get over his son wearing his stupid pearls. Oh yeah, I have the issue right here too. That's right, because I'm a freaking lifetime subscriber of JACOBIN magazine. I know. Socialist exposed. Also the Iran sorry. The Iran stuff is crazy, you know, so I hope everyone's doing good with that. It's a lot. So, that's why we're gonna keep it, you know. Okay, here. Recap. Yesterday, Illinois had its primaries. That was crazy. I used to live in Illinois, and the whole primary process was amazing. And I know that in today's reading, we're going to be talking about nominations. So, yeah, that'll be interesting. Okay, here we go. Let me just link the map. Oh my god. Sorry. Oh. It was so feedback. Okay, hold on. There we go. Okay. Live and okay. And share. Copy link. All right. Let me just upload this to Canvas real quick. So that way all the homies in the class know that we will be doing this. Let's just go to inbox. Okay. I guess I gotta write a whole new message. Course. Sorry, everyone. Jack, what are we? Chapter 9? Oops, not 8. Chapter 9, reading. And let's just copy, paste. There we go. Hey, everyone. Here's the link for the readings. Thanks. All right, now let me add everyone. Students, Adrian. And then let's throw Conroy in there too. Done. All right, send. All right, okay. We're gonna get started reading now. I personally want to read the Hassan thing real quick because I think that's gonna be cool. Okay, so we got to go to page 20. 11. Okay, here we go. All right. Stream of consciousness raising? Stream of consciousness raising. Rising? Thank you. All right. Interview by Alex N. Press. Hassan Piker talks to JACOBIN about radicalization, the right, and his own place in socialist politics, which is get in there. Hassan Piker is one of the most watched political commentators in the United States, with nearly 5 million followers combined on YouTube and Twitch, the platform where he broadcasts almost every day. In recent years, the socialist streamer has been the subject of a familiar set of debates about whether his work radicalizes young viewers or simply absorbs their disconnect, about his proximity or distance from the Democratic Party, and about what it means that so much political attention now flows through privately owned platforms. What often gets obscured is just how stripped down his operation remains. Most days, Piker is alone in a room streaming for hours. Doesn't that sound familiar? He watches the news. Doesn't that sound familiar? Reacts in real time and argues with his viewers. At a moment when the influence of traditional intermediaries like parties, unions, and civic organizations has withered, this is the curious way many young people now encounter politics. We spoke with Piker as he was preparing to travel to Minnesota to cover protests against ICE, immigration and customs enforcement activity in the state. He had also recently returned from a trip to China, an experience that sharpened his sense of how distorted U.S. political narratives are when seen from the outside. Hanging over everything was Palestine and the wave of firings, blacklist, and informal punishments faced by those who have refused to stay silent about Gaza. Here's a pretty cool picture of homie. No, you know what? I'm gonna roast his fit. I don't like the baggy pants on him. The baggy pants bad, the baggy white t-shirt bad, and then the freaking closed toe Birks. Nah, this is a bad fit. It's okay, but it's nothing. It's nothing that should have been put into Teen Jacobin. All right, first question. Before you struck out on your own, you worked for the Young Turks, which your uncle Cenk Uygur founded. But even before that, what first politicized you? Hassan says, my first big political moment was when Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in Turkey in the early 2000s, with the same type of religious populism that Donald Trump came to power with. Turkey was a relatively secular country, so I didn't like that. Then he tried to get his political cartoonists that I used to read all the time prosecuted for depicting him in the ways he did not like. Wow, doesn't that sound familiar? That radicalized me on the issue of free speech. My second moment of radicalization was the impact of the global war on terrorism in the region. You're particularly hardwired against American intervention if you're from that side of the world, so that made me anti-imperialist. But what made me anti-capitalist was receiving my first U.S. healthcare bill at 18 years old. That's when I realized this is completely ridiculous. I always thought it was absurd that Americans didn't have nationalized healthcare, but receiving the bill, I was like, oh my God, this is completely unsustainable. I wonder what that bill was for. Second question. We're speaking the night before the general strike is set to take place in Minnesota. Oh man, that was a while ago then. Where ICE is currently waging war against the people of the state. There are constant reports of families being pulled from their cars, children included, and disappeared into the maze of this country's deportation machine. You've heard you're heading to the city to help give local organizations a voice. What's your analysis of the situation unfolding in Minnesota? Hassan said, it's pretty straightforward. The Trump administration is brutalizing and punishing a blue city and a blue state, putting the crosshairs on the minority population. This time, it's the Somali Americans. And I say Somali Americans because 90% of Somalis living in U.S. soil are American citizens, and 60% of them are natural-born citizens. There is no real reason for immigration enforcement. I personally think that civil offenses pertaining to documentation should not be treated as a major national security threat. It's pure white nativism. Third question. A lot of people view what's happening in Minnesota as the Trump administration seeing just how far they can go. Hassan says, it's a testing ground. Beyond the initial skirmishes and repression, I think they're trying to invite decentralized violence so they can justify applying the Insurrection Act or something along those lines, and then see how far they can take it. Maybe martial law. Who knows? Wow. Okay, Hassan on China. I wanted to see whether the things I read about China were true or if they were exaggerated, and to see Chinese development in real life and how the people feel about it. We got a comprehensive look at China from going to Tiananmen Square for the first flag-raising ceremony of the day, seeing people come from rural parts of the country to participate in this long process where the flag is raised as the sun comes up, to visiting Chongqing, I think, Chengdu, and other cities that have developed dramatically over the last couple of decades. There's so much propaganda surrounding China. It's often presented as a version of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That's true. For a long time, there has been a multi-billion-dollar propaganda initiative that tries to demonize everything China does. I know how much of that was exaggerated or completely fake, so seeing it for myself was rewarding. For example, people talk about the social credit system all the time, but it was an experiment tested in some provinces and then stopped very quickly. It was never consequential as Americans presented it. Americans love pointing out the so-called shame cameras and the idea about your face getting blasted on a jumbotron and your social credit drops. The people I was with were aware of those stories and laughed about them. They pointed at the cameras and said, "These are the famous cameras American thinks snap photos of you and lower your social credit." One of the other things that stood out was how people perceive their government. They have much of a more positive attitude about it than we do. That's reflected in polling, and it's reflected among the people I spoke with. They've seen dramatic improvements in their material conditions over a very short period, and it's understandable why they feel that way. Yeah. When talking to people, what did they want to know about the United States? Interesting. They were just excited that Americans were there. Chinese people are very social and very welcoming. It was striking. A lot of people thought we were Russian once we left Shanghai. When we told them that we were American, they got even more excited. Some were aware that the United States considers China a foreign adversary, but a lot weren't thinking about that at all. They were just excited that there were foreigners. One moment was when I got stopped briefly by a cop in Tiananmen Square. It was later reported in Newsweek like it was some major altercation, but it wasn't. He just asked what was on my phone, we talked, and then he let us go. There was no detention, we kept streaming right after, but in the United States, it turns into a much larger ordeal. What was unique about the trip is that I went with content creators who didn't have strong political opinions about China. When we landed in Beijing, there were Disney vending machines selling Winnie the Pooh figurines. No way, I thought Winnie the Pooh was banned in China. I remember pointing them out immediately. Americans think Winnie the Pooh is banned in China because the memes about people being censored for comparing Xi Jinping to Winnie the Pooh. But there it was, right in the airport. Man, that's crazy. Okay. You faced a lot of vilification for being pro-Palestine. How do you deal with that? You have to ignore it, and now it's much easier to ignore. Anyone who is anti-Zionist before October 7th already knew what was coming. Of course, there were actually anti-Semitic people out there, but people who have been anti-Zionist for decades were aware of the vicious smear of anti-Semitism coming their way at some point. It's an inevitability. Damn. So it wasn't my first time encountering it, but it was definitely more intense and frequent after October 7th. If there's a silver lining, that it's the impact of that slander has softened dramatically. There is a downside to that. The word anti-Semite holds less weight than it used to, which dilutes the impact and enables vicious anti-Semites to get away with anti-Semitic propaganda. There's an entire discourse about how much anti-Semitism is permissible on the Republican side. That's right. It's like Ben Shapiro has a double standard for anti-Semitism. Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, has presented me as his #1 opponent since October 7th. He has talked about me much more frequently than he has, say, about far-right-wing white nationalist Nick Fuentes. Only recently did he start talking about Fuentes, now that it's becoming a major point of contention on the right. But it's not an accident that these guys shy away from criticizing Republicans. They even sometimes defending Elon Musk, for example, doing the double Sig Heil at Trump's second inauguration. That's right. The ADL defended that and said, oh, it was just him being awkward. No, he did the double Sig Heil. But I maintain the majority position on this issue. So it's impossible for these institutions to effectively advocate deplatforming someone like me. Yep, and they've tried so many times. Okay, here's a little bit better picture of Hassan. He's a little girly pop pink. Where do you see the right going post Donald Trump? Interesting. Hassan says, it's directly tied to Donald Trump and where Donald Trump goes. If there's another election, if we have another election at all, which is more up in the air than I think people assume it is, and Trump loses, or whoever comes after Trump loses, I don't know what happens. Because there is no spiritual successor to Trumpism. It's held together by Donald Trump. Yeah. 100% populist. The closest I can find to a successor to Trumpism would be Tucker Carlson. And wow, didn't Tucker Carlson say that recently, this week, between the writing of this article? Like Hassan pre-watch Piker called it. Tucker Carlson has been kind of flirting with running for president, I think. He said the other day, I would run for president just so I can debate Ted Cruz on the stage. Because, Tucker Carlson is anti-Israel or anti-Zionist at this point. I don't know. Whatever. He's anti-Israel. And Ted Cruz and like Mike Huckabee. Ted Cruz and all those evangelical type Christian Zionists have been very, very supportive of Israel. And I don't think that's something that the right is down for. I say for the time being, because I think Tucker Carlson is still very much a descendant of a CIA agent, and not only that, but a bit of a grifter. Yeah, 100%. I don't know if he has ambitions for higher office or not, but he's the only person I see being able to hold onto Trump's space. Someone who's telegenic, charismatic, and smart enough to not step on certain landmines. Whereas JD Vance is repulsive to so many people. Crazy. People are always asking whether you help or hurt Democrats. Everyone is completely fixated on the idea that one person, a media figure, can save the Democrats. Yeah, no. It's the whole Joe Rogan of the left. That's because we have no robust, active political organization. We don't even have voters who believe their vote matters at all that much. It all stems from the place of powerlessness, or at least a subtle recognition of our powerlessness. The view that politics is pure spectacle and pure team sports. Yep. The media played a role in this. They see themselves as doing marketing for one side or the other. And that's why all these debates are never around what parties can do for the population, what parties can do for their votes, what parties can do for the people, or what even certain organizations can do. Instead, it's about who has better PR and who has better marketing. It's Wendy's versus McDonald's. You can't podcast your way out of the problem. Yes, there is a flood of information coming from the right, and it's important to address and combat that, but there are issues outside of that, such as the way people perceive the Democratic Party that directly revolves around its inaction or total lack of interest in addressing the economic hardships people are going through. Take healthcare, for example. There's a bipartisan consensus that healthcare has to be private, has to be in the hands of the private insurance providers. That's ridiculous, but it's the consensus of most Democrats and every single Republican. The fact that Democrats don't even enter the notion of launching an opposition to that is the reason why people just go, okay, well, there's no difference here. Neither party represents my interest. Most people are used to not having their needs met and they don't expect it anymore. That's why people like Zoran Mamdani are such a breath of fresh air for so many people. Next question. Why do you think people watch you? Hassan says, people experience things not being all right and have a suspicion as to why. And they rarely get to hear that in mainstream news. So if they tune into someone like me, and if I can catch them on an issue they care about or have personal knowledge of, they realize that I understand it in a way mainstream outlets don't, and they keep listening. Hopefully, I can make a convincing case for why it is actually the system that is designed to keep them struggling the way they do. Yep, 100%. That's why I'm doing it too. All right, so that was Hassan Piker's little interview on Jacobin. So thank you. Shout out to Hassan. All right, let's get to reading Political Parties Chapter 9 now. Let me take some drinks. Oh, I need to look up what the questions are for this too. Okay, hold on. Let me do a little timestamp. And this is Chapter 9, nominations, because I think we're going to go over how nominations happen. All right. Oh, yeah, I need to... Questions. No modules. Okay, week 9? Oh, and then we have some additional readings too. Okay, so the question is, what are the two questions parties try to answer in nominating candidates? Let me just copy and paste this and put it in chat. All right. Okay. Let me get the second question. And then, oh no, question number 3, what's a jungle primary? That sounds awful. Oh, thank you. Look, sorry, got a little breakfast, a little egg McMuffle. I don't know. Thank you. My beautiful wife made it for me. I'm gonna eat it real quick. Oh yeah, and then we have some additional readings. Oh my god. Sorry, I can't with Ezra Klein. We have an Ezra Klein reading. I'm not, it's not that I hate him or anything. It's just I'm so tired of the abundance debate. Oh, it's an opinion thing. Okay, so I guess I shouldn't be that much of a hater. And then, oh, we have another opinion from Noel. Oh, what's this debate you speak of? Thank you, Stardust. Happy to see you. Beautiful Stardust City Hags, best mod in the chat, as always. The abundance debate. Ezra Klein put out this book after the end of after Trump was elected, and he was like, this is what Democrats are doing wrong, and this is how Democrats can fix it. And so let's see. He apparently wants to have an open Democratic convention, which I don't know how to feel about that, because I'm pretty sure open conventions means anyone can vote in it. And I don't want Republicans flooding into the Democratic convention. I want it to just be Democrats voting. I don't know. We'll see. We'll have to read his little opinion on this, and then you know what? Why can't we watch this? It's from the Ezra Klein show, February. Let's see. Let me go to YouTube. Ezra Klein show. February. Whoops. Caps locks is on. February 21st, 2024. Let's see. Is this it? 1 year ago?
I've been spending some time recently with
more. Let's see if read the full transcript here. Why Democrats? No, that's not it. What is it? Here's how open Democratic convention would work. Oh, that's exactly. Let's see. Let me just search open. Okay, here we go. Oh my god. I can't with his twink ass face. Sorry. The beard really masked him up. Okay, so it's from February 21st, 2024. Okay, wait, no, here it is. In February, I made the case for Democratic convention, blah, blah, blah. I interviewed Elaine Carmack. This conversation was recorded in 2024. Okay, let's see if...
New York Times opinion. This is the Ezra Klein Show. So a number of months ago, I made the argument that Joe Biden should step aside and Democrats should pick their nominee at an open convention. That used to be how it was done. Now we use primaries, and conventions have become largely public relations affairs. But if something happened to the nominee who'd won the primaries, or if a party decided to go in a different direction, the convention is still there. So Joe Biden's rough performance at the first presidential debate has brought back the question of whether Democrats should go another way and choose a candidate at their convention. There's no doubt this is risky. There's no doubt they don't really have muscle memory on this anymore. But there's also no doubt that going forward with Joe Biden at this point is an incredibly risky strategy, too. So how does a convention actually work? What would happen if Democrats did try this? Back in February, when I was making this argument the first time, I had Elaine Kamarck on the show to talk about exactly that. Kamarck is really the leading expert here. She's worked on 4 presidential campaigns, on 10 nominating conventions, both for Democrats and Republicans. She's been on the DNC Rules Committee for many years. She's the author of the book on this, Primary Politics, and she's a senior fellow at Brookings. I found the conversation incredibly helpful then. And as people think about this now, or even if you're just a political junkie who wants to think a little bit about how this happened differently in American history, I think it's even more relevant today. As always, my email, EzraKleinShow@nytimes.com. Elaine Kamarck, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I want to begin with something that you've said before, which is that selecting
All right,
a
we're on
nominee
the right
is
thing.
a
I don't gotta read,
process,
thank
not
God.
an event. Tell me about that.
Well, there's 2 stages to picking a president, right? One is the primaries, and second is actually choosing the delegates. So the primaries allocate the delegates. The winner of the primary gets 5 delegates from this state. The actual people who are chosen as those 5 people are not picked until weeks or sometimes months after the primary. Unlike any other election in the United States, it is a sequence of elections, not one single election. It starts in January or February, goes all the way to the beginning of June. And because it's sequential, it has a different dynamic. The primary in one state has an impact on the voters in the next state, et cetera, all the way until some candidate seems to have a majority of delegates going to the convention. And then if that doesn't happen, there is a convention, and the convention is the ultimate authority.
That isn't how we did it in, say, 1900. So before we get to how we did it in 1900, why did we move to the sequential primary process? What was the underlying theory of the problems that it solved?
It had to do mostly with 1968 and the anti-war movement. In the old days, a lot of delegates went into the convention and they were uncommitted. You didn't know who they were going to vote for at the convention. And by the way, the voters just thought this was natural. They understood this to be a party process, not a public process. And as you may remember from your history books, in 1968, Lyndon Johnson dropped out of the presidential race in March. Even though he won the New Hampshire primary, the Gene McCarthy came pretty close to him in the New Hampshire primary, and he decided to get out of the race and focus on getting out of Vietnam.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
That meant that there were 2 sort of kinds of candidates running. There was Hubert Humphrey, who inherited a lot of Lyndon Johnson's political power and delegates. Humphrey, by the way, was the vice president back then. And then there was Gene McCarthy, and then eventually Robert F. Kennedy, who ran on an anti-war platform, on a new generation platform, et cetera. And what happened was they couldn't win delegates. And so if you want to get a sense of this, you can go to YouTube history and you'll see that there was sort of a riot outside of the convention in Chicago.
That's right.
Thus, the night that Vice President Humphrey was to
Chicagoans be
receive the
rioting.
Democratic Party's nomination for president was also the night of the bloodiest confrontation.
Hundreds of marchers and dozens of policemen were injured. Restraint was absent on both sides. This was later called a police riot.
And there was sort of a riot inside the convention in Chicago.
Mr. Chairman, thousands of young people are being beaten in the streets of Chicago.
Wisconsin is not recognized for that purpose.
In other words, the 1968 Democratic Convention really blew up. And as a result, they established a commission to look at the way the party selected delegates. And that changed everything.
But I want to get at something a little confusing in there, which is, as you mentioned, there were primaries before 1968. There were primaries in 1968. You just said Johnson won the primary against McCarthy. So what were those primaries doing if they weren't choosing the candidate?
Well, first of all, there were very few of them. I think in 68, there were only about 16. And secondly, and most importantly, they were not binding. In other words, a candidate could win the primary and not win any delegates from that state. The process of selecting delegates was not related to the outcome of the primary. Almost all the primaries prior to 1972 were what we used to call beauty contest primaries. In other words, sometimes they were useful in seeing
Beauty
which
contest
candidate did well
primaries?
with
That's
the voters,
amazing.
but
That sounds like
basically
what's happening
they were
today.
not determinative of winning delegates.
So I want to get at something because I just find this period in our elections fascinating. So delegates make the choice of who the nominee is going to be at the convention. But you also have these primaries that are about giving the delegates functionally information. I think the very famous one is John F. Kennedy in West Virginia. Can you talk a bit about what that primary was and why it then mattered for the convention, even if he didn't win any delegates?
Sure. It's a fascinating example of what used to happen in the old days. Kennedy's big problem, as far as the rest of the party was concerned, was that he was a Roman Catholic. And back then, people were not sure that a Roman Catholic could be elected president. There was all this stuff going around about would he answer to the Pope.
I'm sorry. As a certified Catholic, I have to speak on this. It was crazy. It was crazy to see people bring up this debate with Joseph Robinette Biden. They're like, he's a Catholic. He's going to take orders from the Pope.
Not the Constitution, that sort of thing. So Kennedy needed a place where he could prove to the party elders, like Governor Lawrence of Pennsylvania, who controlled the whole Pennsylvania delegation, Governor Brown of California. He needed to prove that he could win in a
old-ass Governor
Protestant
Brown.
state. He could win
Amazing.
Protestant voters. And he won the Wisconsin primary, but when the powers that be looked at the results and looked at the internals, they said, wait a minute, you won this because of an outpouring of support in Catholic precincts. You didn't win Protestants. So that meant he had to look for another primary, and he went on to the West Virginia primary. And in West Virginia, there weren't very many Catholics, so it was an all-Protestant state, and he won West Virginia. And by winning West Virginia, he seemed to have answered one of the big questions about his candidacy, which is, could he win votes in Protestant states? And when that happened, a lot of the people who were watching him, party leaders, elected officials across the country, said, maybe this guy can do it and maybe we will support him.
And so all this then is getting to this question of the delegates. And in this period in political life, who are the delegates and why do people think it is, one, legitimate for them to choose a party nominee, right? Who are they to make that decision? And two, why would they be good at choosing a party nominee? What gives them the expertise to make that decision?
In this period of time, and frankly, it's not so different in our own period, delegates are people who have some relationship to their political party. They can be labor union members in the Democratic Party. They can be county chairmen. They can be precinct chairmen. There's some people who are political actors. They can be the mayor of a small town. They can be a county commissioner. Maybe they worked for the party. Maybe they were a super fundraiser for the party, whatever. But they had strong links to the political party.
So then 1968 happens. It's a disaster. This commission is appointed. What do they report out?
Well, there's two things that really changed fundamentally the way this whole system works. The first was that primaries had to be binding. And so in the old days, a lot of people went to the convention uncommitted. What changed in 72 was the delegates still had to get themselves elected, but they had to be pledged to a presidential candidate. You had to establish a presidential preference, and the presidential preference had to have some relationship to the outcome of the primary. The second change that happened was the requirement that in caucus states, the caucuses should be held at the same time throughout the state. Because
Yeah.
in the old days, like in Iowa, the caucuses would be held over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. Well,
That's
the problem
right.
was the press could not figure out who was winning. I mean, it was almost impossible to go through, 99 counties in Iowa and thousands of precinct caucuses and figure out who was winning. As soon as you required them to all be at the same day on the same time, well, guess what? They could count and announce it to the press at 11 o'clock, and that was a big story. And what that meant is it essentially turned caucuses into the functional equivalent of a primary. And between those two things, really, we've never looked back. Interestingly enough, Ezra, at the time, no one really understood how big a change this was going to be.
Tell me more about why you say that. This is obviously a pretty big change to move from having a convention full of uncommitted delegates who make their decision on the floor of the convention to a convention driven by primaries and caucuses that happened well before. So when you say they didn't understand how big of a change it would be, what did they think they were doing and what did they not predict that then happened?
I think they thought they would still control the system. But in fact, once you moved to binding primaries, control moved from the party leaders and the elected officials to voters in primaries. And I don't think anyone anticipated what a profound change that was going to be. They did see it in 1972 when, to the consternation of lots of party officials and elected Democrats, the Democrats nominated George McGovern.
This is a people's nomination, and next January, we will restore the government to the people of this country. And I believe that American politics will never be quite the same again.
And that's when the light bulb went off and people said, oh no, what have we done?
One of the ways I hear this justified now, and more than justified, one of the ways I hear things happening at party conventions delegitimized is the idea that primaries are democratic and party leaders or party members making these decisions are non-democratic, right? There was a lot of uproar in 2016 about the potential for superdelegates to act at the convention. That didn't end up being relevant, but people were worried about it.
God, I remember the superdelegates.
Primaries themselves are not particularly representative. I mean, they're democratic in the sense that if you qualify, if you're part of the party in the right state, you can vote. But relatively few people in those states vote in primaries. Primaries are something that the kind of intense, hardcore faithful or the otherwise well-mobilized do. So how do you think about that question of what is democratic here? The sort of representative function of the local party members acting, the participation function of anyone who wants to can come out to vote. Like, how do you think about the trade-offs from a perspective of representation and democracy?
There are two different ways to think about representation in democracy. The primary voter, that's a form of sort of direct democracy, right? You're going to put a bunch of names in front of primary voters, and they're going to choose who they like the best. Then there is representative democracy. That's what we have when we elect senators and representatives to Congress, right? We are electing them to make decisions on a wide variety of issues before us. The party leaders and elected officials are almost always elected by someone. In other words, that's one of the things that was missing from the superdelegate debates that we've had in recent years. Congressmen are all elected by many, many more people than sometimes vote in presidential primaries. The senators certainly are elected by a lot more people. The members of the Democratic National Committee are elected people. So this is just a different form of democracy. It's more representative democracy than direct democracy. And that's where the battle is. Some people think that it's only direct democracy that matters. The other thing that gets lost in this debate is that political parties are covered under the First Amendment of the Constitution, under the right of free association. And a lot of court cases over the years have said, in essence, look, a political party can do mostly what they want to do in terms of how they nominate candidates, presidential, congressional, gubernatorial, whatever. They can do that as long as they don't run up against another constitutional right. So the clearest example is the Democratic Party of Texas decided that they were going to have an all-white primary. Black people were not going to be allowed to vote in the primary. Sounds amazing this day and age, but that's what they did. And back in the 1940s, this went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the court said, look, the Democratic primary is tantamount to winning the election, and therefore, if you deprive people of their right to vote in a primary, you are depriving them of their 14th Amendment rights.
Amazing.
And of course, that has stood for many, many years. Nobody ever tried that one again. But on other questions, like how you allocate delegates to candidates, the courts have basically said, no, that's in the purview of the political parties.
One of the other tricky distinctions here to me is that there's this question of who can participate, right? Can you vote in a primary? Then there is this question of what you can vote for in the primary. We have this distinction between primaries, which we see as roughly democratic, and conventions, brokered conventions, which we understand is roughly controlled by parties. But that can break down a bit. So to make this clearer, look at this year. Go back to September. There's a poll by CNN. 2/3 of Democratic-leaning voters do not want Joe Biden to run again. They don't know who they want to run.
Right.
Nobody in the poll has a large amount of support beyond Joe Biden, but they don't want Biden. They want to find somebody else. But nobody else who is a significant player in the Democratic Party runs. So in a sense, you have a primary happening right now. Joe Biden just completely dominated in South Carolina. But what you have is a brokered primary. There was a lot of party pressure to not have other Democrats jump in. They wanted a united front. They didn't want people weakening Joe Biden. So how do you think about a primary like this year? Because on the one hand, it is a primary. You can vote for it, but there's not really any other choices to vote for if you're a Democrat. So what role is a primary really playing?
Well, I think this is less to do with primaries and more to do with incumbency. I mean, if you look back over the last 50 years when we've had primaries, very often the incumbent president doesn't have an opposition in the primary. Bill Clinton didn't have any opposition in 1996. Donald Trump didn't have any opposition in 2020. That's mostly because when you're a sitting president, you have a lot of control over your party. You're doing things for your party, you're raising money for the party, you're making friends. Running against an incumbent president is really hard work. Once the primary is open, however, and there's no incumbent president, we've had no trouble having people get in the primary. There's been lots and lots and lots of people in the primary, as you can recall from some of the recent debate stages, which were so crowded.
Oh my God, we're going to an ad. Okay, come on.
So I want to talk a bit about
All
what
right.
would happen if this year, when the primaries are no longer a viable way for Democrats to pick a candidate, they no longer have an incumbent. Joe Biden steps down. He decides that this isn't right for him any longer. If Biden steps down in April, right, if he says, I've just decided that the right thing for me is to finish out my term and pass leadership on to the next generation of Democrats, what happens? What would begin from there?
Well, beginning in April, you're going to see a lot of state conventions, county conventions, et cetera, going through April, May, and June. And in those conventions, the party participants, and anybody can come to the first of these things, they will pick delegates. They'll pick delegates to the state convention or to a congressional district convention, and they will actually choose the people who go to the national convention in Chicago. So let's suppose that Joe Biden dropped out in April. The people who would want to replace him will engage in a very grassroots campaign to get their loyalists in the state elected to go to the national convention. It will be a little bit like the old-fashioned world. Just because there weren't primaries doesn't mean that people weren't running around the country trying to get support. Teddy Kennedy was at the state convention in Wyoming speaking for his brother. And Robert Kennedy was all over the country.
Wait, sorry. I just need to pause this real quick because I'm so confused about the timeline on this. Okay, because they're talking. This article is from February 2024. The election was November 2024, right? And Joe Biden dropped out of the race in July. So this is from February, and Ezra Klein and the other lady are talking about Joe Biden possibly dropping out in April, and he didn't drop out until July. Oh man. Okay, so yeah, if y'all remember the 2024 election, it was a big debacle because Joe Biden was like, "Yep, I'm just going to run again." Even though I said before I was elected in 2020, I said I was not going to be a two-term president. Joe Biden went and was like, "Nope, I'm going to run for a second term." And then he held that position all the way until July, and people back in February were talking about it. I forget when he did that that debate with Donald Trump. Okay. Because I want to say it was in the summertime. But yeah, that debate with Donald Trump. Yeah, whatever. It's okay. Oh, the debate sent many Democrats into panic. But when was that? Debate with Trump, June. Okay, so already in February, we had people talking about how Biden needed to step down so that way they could have an open primary. Because if you remember, back in 2024, even Donald Trump and J.D. Vance were like, Kamala Harris is not a legit candidate. They didn't have an open primary, and they were trying to get her to kick her off the ballot, right? I remember this very distinctly because it was so freaking crazy. It's like, why do these Republicans care about a Democratic primary? You know, literally, they chose what the frick is her name? Kamala Harris to run as the person. She's the vice president. Okay, yes, we didn't have an open primary, but like, if Democrats weren't complaining about it, why are Republicans complaining about it? So yeah, this 2024 was a wreck, and I know that's like 2 years ago, but oh my God.
The state conventions and county conventions and trying to get support for Jack. This was going on way under the surface. And if, in fact, the president was not running, the same thing would happen. People would be out there on behalf of a Gavin Newsom or Governor Whitmer or whoever. People would be out there trying to get people elected to the convention that supported them.
Yeah.
It's a very, very grassroots undertaking. We haven't seen it in more than half the century, but that's what would go on.
Go a level deeper. When you say they would go to the convention and try to make it such that delegates who liked them were named. So if you're Gavin Newsom, you want Gavin Newsom-oriented delegates, because the best way to win a delegate is to have that delegate be for you before they ever walk in the door. What do you do? Who are you trying to convince? How do you know who those delegates are? What kind of politicking is actually happening there?
It is a politicking among the activists in the Democratic Party, because those are the people who seek to run as delegates. You would be finding your supporters in the state and encouraging them to go to the county convention or go to the state convention. You would be finding your friends. And again, you need a lot of friends to run for president, and you need to have a lot of friends all over the country, which, by the way, is why incumbent presidents do so well and incumbent vice presidents actually do so well, is that they have a chance to make friends all over the place.
Kamala
and in this
had it
scenario, you would
lined up.
really need friends all over the country. In Pennsylvania, you need them. You need them in California. You need them all over the place in order to find enough people who would be willing to go engage in this election and get elected as your delegates to the convention.
I want to get at the way that would lead to a different selection than primaries, particularly I think in the very modern social media-oriented attention era do. Which is to say that when one of the main questions is, do you have friends all over the country? Are you able to influence these delegate slates? It seems to me, looking back on history, to select more for candidates who are broadly acceptable to their party and select against candidates who are maybe insurgent-oriented, who are very controversial inside their party. So this is a kind of process, I think it is safe to say, that knocks Donald Trump out of contention. In a world of delegates and conventions, in 2016, Donald Trump does not win the Republican nomination. This is the kind of person who is knocked out by that. But Bernie Sanders probably also does not do nearly as well as he does. And on the other hand, it pushes
Hold
oftentimes,
on,
maybe
I
not
got
always.
beef with Ezra Klein. Hold on. He said, so this is the kind of process I think is safe to say that knocks Donald Trump out of the contention. In a world of delegates and conventions, in 2016, Donald Trump does not win the Republican nomination. This is the kind of person who is knocked out by that. But Bernie Sanders probably also does not do nearly as well as he does. And on the other hand, it pushes, oftentimes, maybe not always, towards candidates who are well known. Your Hillary Clintons, your Joe Bidens. Yeah, nobody wants those. Nobody wanted Hillary Clinton. Okay. It's just dumb. And I think limiting the amount, like, Ezra Klein is simultaneously saying he wants open primaries for everyone to vote in, but then also wants these establishment candidates to be the only ones that get picked, I think is what he's saying. I don't know. It's, like I said, I have my reservations about Ezra.
Towards candidates who are, well-known, your Hillary Clintons, your Joe Bidens, et cetera. Is that a fair way to think about it, that it selects for people who are broadly acceptable to the wide coalition, but against people who might be intensely generating enthusiasm in smaller factions of the party that are trying to make a run for dominance?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it. I don't think it's absolute. I don't think it's as dramatic as some people would have you believe, because, in fact, in the many decades since these reforms, both parties have managed to elect a lot of times very mainstream type candidates, right? Like a Mondale or a Mitt Romney or someone like that. But if the old system were to happen today, it also allows for an element of peer review. Now, peer review, if you need brain surgery, right, you go to a brain surgeon who has had other brain surgeons say this person is, yes, capable of doing that. You don't pick your brain surgeon on the basis of his smile or his ability to do well on television. You're looking for sheer competence. That's all. We have peer review in all sorts of areas of American life. Your manicurist has to have a license and has to know enough not to give you an infection in your nails. So, there's peer review all over. The modern primary system is devoid of peer review.
Oh my God.
There is no place where people who know about government say, hey, this person can or cannot do the job of president of the United States. Had you had some peer review in 2016, Donald Trump probably wouldn't have made it.
Oh
And
my God.
take the
Okay,
following-
sorry. I'm gonna fight with this lady right now. This is a distraction. You can skip forward a little bit if you want to continue hearing this. But like, what? What do you mean Donald Trump had peer review? He literally, the candidates he was on stage with, the Ted Cruz, the Marco Rubio, the one, the black brain surgeon, I forget what his name is right now, but Mike Huckabee, of the curly haired libertarian, I forget what his name is, Rand Paul, Ayn Rand, whatever the frick his name is, you know? These people were all like, nope, Donald Trump can't run. Donald Trump is not good. And then they still let him be on the debate stage with them. They still let him, like, Ted Cruz let Donald Trump make fun of his wife to his face. And Ted Cruz is still like, yep, Donald Trump, that's my man. I'm voting for him. It was never, the peer review doesn't matter, okay? In my opinion, or I'm making this statement. It's not even opinion. I feel like I have facts to back it up, and that's the case I'm making here, right? The parties are going to pick whoever's going to win, because that's what happened in 2016 with the Republicans. They all hated Donald Trump to begin with, but then when they saw that he was going to bring them the votes, they all fell in line. And that's what I wish the Democrats would do, because I bet that is what would have happened in 2016 with Bernard Sanders. All right, that's it. I'm done complaining about Bernie.
Fun example. Jack Kennedy in 1960 had to go to Governor Lawrence of Pennsylvania. He was the boss, the big boss of Pennsylvania. He controlled the whole delegation, and it was a big one. And he had to go to him and convince him that he would be a good candidate and a good president. So imagine the conversation. Obviously, it's in a smoke-filled room. There's probably some brown liquid, a scotch or a bourbon on the table, and the two men are talking. And, obviously Kennedy does a pretty good job convincing Governor Lawrence. And, they talk about politics, but they also talk about government. Now, imagine Donald Trump having to encounter a Governor Lawrence in order to win the delegates in Pennsylvania. And he goes in, of course, the room's no longer smoke-filled because we don't smoke anymore, but he goes in and he says, I'm going to build a wall on the southern border between us and Mexico. And the governor says, well, okay, I guess that's a feasible idea and probably pretty popular. And then he says, and I'm going to have Mexico pay for it. Mm-hmm. Now, that has to be one of the more ridiculous statements a presidential candidate has made. How on earth would you do that? Would you go to war with Mexico to make them pay for a wall? I don't think so, okay? And
people
do
not care.
Another elected official, another person in government saying, huh? How would you do that, right? In other words, these candidates in this system, there is a measure of competence that takes place. And therefore, a Marianne Williamson would never even get in the door. We would still have...
Hold on. Those of you who do not know Marianne Williamson, she is the ultimate crystal mommy. She ran for president in, I don't know how many times. And actually, she was on Hassan's stream. Hold on. Hasanabi. There we go. Hasanabi debates Marianne Williamson.
Ladies,
hold on.
Move the conversation. This is their lives. And I
here's
think
this
that
lady.
those of us who are progressive need to say that.
But like people were like, she's crazy. She's like basically the Green Party. I forget who but anyways, like, damn, like why? I know okay, so she's like a writer, I think. I think she's like an author or something. And she's just a person who decided to run for the primaries, and it's just like so many of them. And it's like, I'm for having as many people to pick from. Because and then we're going to end up in a situation where it's like everyone is like, Gavin Newsom is our guy. He's the only one.
And I don't care. Maybe you don't like me for whatever reason. Whatever. For, these narratives that are spun or kooky, wacky, whatever, which is, I don't think there's anything kooky or wacky about 68,000 people dying every year from lack of health care, 18 million Americans unable to fulfill their prescriptions, 85 million under or uninsured Americans. And no, I have no crystals in my book or in my home or in my lectures. So if
she
people
said,
can't
I don't
see
have any crystals in my book, in my home, or in my lectures. Oh my God. Yeah, sorry. So Marianne Williamson, Crystal Mommy, Stardust City Hag said Jill Stein was another one. Yes. Jill Stein. Oh my God. All right, let's go back to Ezra Klein and
logical candidates, but we wouldn't have candidates who were really running to get a slot on CNN or to sell books. We would clear the field of those kinds of candidates.
Let me ask if that's not a little bit sunnier of a view of this than sometimes it really was, because I mean, you know infinitely more about all this than I do, but my sense is that there were sharper boundaries, that it was partially about ideology. The party professionals, the center of the party, the people who held elected office, they were worried about more than competence. They were worried about their power. They were worried about what they would get from this candidate or that candidate. They had their views about what would play well in the electorate. They had their views about, what they wanted to see happen in government, right? The Governor Lawrence presumably had substantive commitments that he cared about and wanted whoever the candidate was to actually be doing when they were president. And they also have all kinds of biases about just what a president looks like, right? I mean, as you were saying, John F. Kennedy had to get through all these traps about whether or not a president could be a Roman Catholic. If you'd had a convention process, Barack Obama was obviously a very, very talented politician and quite well liked within the Democratic Party. But if it had just been a convention, would those same party poobahs have thought that a black man with the name Barack Hussein Obama in 2008 could have won? I mean, maybe not. They might have said, you know what, you're great. Hillary Clinton's a safe choice. So I just want to push on that a little bit, because from my read of it, competence was not the only thing these people cared about. There was a lot of trading, of horse trading, of assuming.
The genuine.
And that's partially why I think a lot of people now feel it's not that it wasn't
genuine.
legitimate. I mean, the brokering, people don't
Someone
say that
authentic.
word with a highly positive affect.
They were not in the business of taking chances. You're right. They were interested in winning, and they were interested in governance and in preserving, of course, their own power. But remember, their own power was not dependent on the presidential candidate. Their own power came from being elected in their states. They knew something about how to win because of the place they were in. And their judgments tended to be pretty good judgments about what it would take to win at least their state.
Now, let me ask you about a different timeline here. Let's say it is August 1st. The primaries are over. The delegates are selected, committed, primarily now to Joe Biden. And Joe Biden has a health event or just realizes that he can't do this. It's not for him right now. And he steps down. What happens then so close to the convention?
Oh, my
Well,
God.
at that point, you have 4,000 and some people who are already elected delegates on their way to Chicago. And I think that other people will throw their hat in the ring, and they're going to have to convince those delegates in convention because there's not much time, right? So you will have what you
107
had in the old days. Delegations will meet in their hotels, and the candidates will go from hotel to hotel, or their surrogates, talking to the delegations and trying to get support. You would have the wives or the husbands being surrogates. You'd have other surrogates going to the smaller state delegations. And meantime, of course, you'd have a wild social media campaign going on. You'd have polling going on. You'd have all the other things going on. It'd be pretty wild. You might need another day for the convention because there'd be so much work to do. And odds are you'd have to go beyond one ballot for somebody to get the nomination. Odds are you'd need a first ballot just to figure out where everybody was. And then you'd probably take a break before you had your second ballot. It would be pretty wild, okay? It would be pretty wild. I think for political reporters, Ezra, it would be the most fun of your whole life, and you'd love it. I think the voters would be absolutely tuned into their televisions. This would be great reality TV, if you will. It would be reality politics.
Reality
but there are rules
politics,
and processes
damn.
for getting through this, and I think at the end of the day, you would have a Democratic nominee. Now, who knows how that would play in a general election, especially if only one party was going through this. Who knows what that would do to the general election, but it would be an old-fashioned convention.
Well, let me try to live in this world for a minute, right? Try to imagine how it would feel and what would happen. Let's think August, maybe July, right? There are a couple months here. Here's what I see happening. There is a mad dash. I mean, Joe Biden gives a speech, gives a sort of heroic, honorable speech. I've decided, that it's the right thing for me is to
Wow,
be a bridge
that's
to the next
exactly what
generation.
happened,
That we all need to know when our time is up, that I have important work that I still need to focus on in trying to defend Ukraine and Israel-Palestine and all these different things. And so there's this sort of applause to Joe Biden. And then all of a sudden, there is this mad dash. You have, of course, Vice President Harris, but it's very easy to name 8 or 10 other people who would be, very plausible here. Buttigieg, Raimondo, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Jared Polis, Raphael Warnock. Anybody can have their list. Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar. CNN and MSNBC are going to start running candidate forums like on the daily. And, as many of these can actually be done because, one, they can actually shift the world, right? I mean, you really, if the right 5,000 people watch this, you might just win the convention and the nomination and become the next president. They're going to be giving speeches. They're going to be sitting for 1 million interviews and podcasts. Very busy time on the Ezra Klein Show. So there's going to be a month or 2 month period here where they're doing the thing that you talked about with the beauty contest primaries earlier. They are trying in every form they can think of to show that they have that it factor, right? That they are electric, that they will win, that they know how to hold the tensions of this moment and inspire, but also maybe convince voters who would be wavering from the Democrats. You would have a run-up period, depending on how long it is, that would not really be primary-oriented, but would be mass media-oriented, because you're trying to shift polling, shift narratives, be on social media in a way that the delegates who are coming walk into that convention thinking, it's pretty clear to me that Gretchen Whitmer is the one who could win this election, or it's pretty clear to me that Ro Khanna is a person setting people aflame. And so in a kind of often dead period, you have what would be a genuinely riveting Democratic spectacle. I think the thing people worry about, and quite reasonably, is that the party fractures here, that the fighting immediately becomes riven with ill will, that it becomes toxic, that, should this be given to Vice President Harris? And if it's not given to Vice President Harris, does that mean the party is passing over a black woman? What does that mean about the party? But that it could also just be a contest. I mean, how do you imagine that playing out?
Oh, Ezra, I think that's hard to say, right? I mean, that really is hard
How do you
to
mean it
say.
feeling? I don't mean how do you mean it ending, but how do you imagine people acting within this period?
Oh my God.
My guess is it would not turn toxic.
Oh.
I'll tell you why. It's too short of a period of time. The first thing candidates do is they try to introduce themselves in a favorable light to the voters. In this case, the voters are basically 4,000 people who are packing their bags to go to Chicago. And it would be sort of a bad idea to get really toxic at that point, because if your first introduction to these people is you're out there saying ugly things about Kamala Harris or you're out there saying ugly things about Gavin Newsom, it's probably not a smart thing to do. And I don't think the divisions within the Democratic Party are as ugly as the divisions within the Republican Party. If Trump was your example here, I think this could get really ugly if the Republicans were confronting the same thing. But the Democratic divisions are simply not that deep. And you just don't have time. You just don't have time. And you'd always be worried about how is this impacting these 4,000 people. There would be a lot of attention to who these people are and a lot of seeking the biographies of these people of every single vote. And there would be an advantage to being from a big state, which is sort of not important anymore, but used to be. So Gavin Newsom would go in with by far the biggest block of delegates to the Democratic convention. Texas, New York, Illinois, they would all have big blocks of delegates. And if you came from one of those states, you would have an advantage, no doubt about it, going into the convention.
You mentioned a minute ago that you've got these 4,000 plus delegates coming. And that implies that there are 4,000 plus individual decision makers. There are also super delegates, senators and members of Congress from the party. But is it that many individual people? When people talk about the brokered convention, when you talked about John F. Kennedy meeting with governors, I think there's a sense, at least from the past, that maybe not everybody votes as a bloc, but there are decision makers who sway their groups and who have a lot of power. Who has power in this? Like, is this a world where, Ben Wickler, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, and LaVora Barnes, the chair of the Michigan Democratic Party, do they become super powerful? Are they the brokers? If you are a candidate, who are you really trying to meet with and move here?
Well, it's going to differ from state to state because, first of all, if you have a governor in the state, so in Michigan, it would not be the party chair, it would be Gretchen Whitmer herself. So one of the things I can tell you that most people don't realize is I've been a delegate to 10 Democratic conventions and I've sat in the delegation, and you'd be amazed how little of the conversation has to do with the presidential candidate. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. So for all the years I sat in the Massachusetts delegation, I don't think I ever had a conversation about the presidential candidates. It was all about who's going to be the next Speaker of the House, how many seats do we think we can pick up in the legislature, who's going to run for Attorney General. It was all local politics. Now, given that it's so local politics, people who are powerful in the state are going to be the ones that can most easily sway the delegates. So a sitting governor is going to be very important. If you don't have a sitting governor, but you've got, say, one United States senator, that person's going to be very important. The other thing you have at a Democratic convention, and you have a lot of members of labor unions. So the labor union members will probably meet and caucus aside from whatever state they're in. So if you're a UAW member and you get to the convention as a delegate, you're going to pay a lot of attention to what the UAW president says and to what the president of the AFL-CIO says. You'll have different blocks according to where people's, interests lie. So it'll be a combination of interest groups and political power within each state.
Okay, we got another ad. Let's go back to political parties chapter and read that because that's more important right now. We still need to answer these questions. All right. So chapter 9, nominations. They were talking about Taft and everyone. So, all right. On June 22nd, 1912, former Republican President Theodore Roosevelt and most of his progressive Republican supporters ditched the Republican National Convention at the Chicago Coliseum and convened for a speech a few blocks away at Orchestra Hall. Roosevelt, with one foot in the Republican Party and one foot out, asked his supporters to find out whether a third-party run for president would be viable. Thus began Roosevelt's nomination with the Progressive Party candidate for president. At the moment, Democrat Woodrow Wilson was effectively handed the U.S. presidency. Roosevelt and his supporters bolted the Republican convention because incumbent President Taft was about to win renomination. Everything about the convention was contested, from the seating of delegates to the selection of the presidential nominee. But the Taft forces were winning. Roosevelt claimed that Taft's success came from dishonest tactics. And so the former president asked his supporters not to vote for any presidential candidate at all. Instead, they would form the Progressive Party, also called the Bull Moose Party. And Roosevelt ran as their nominee. And he lost. This meant that in the general election, there were 2 Republicans on the ballot, a current Republican incumbent in Taft and the party's former president in Roosevelt. In the general election, Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote, and Wilson won the presidency with only 42% of the popular vote. Had everyone who voted for Taft or Roosevelt voted for the same candidate, that candidate would have easily won the election. While the progressives never won the White House, Progressive Party candidates did later win some congressional seats, and at the time they may have believed their third party had the potential to supplant one of the two major parties. From the point of view of Progressive Party activists, therefore, Roosevelt's defection from his party may have made sense. From the point of view of Republican Party, the institution concerned with winning elections, the defection was a spectacular failure. More than a century later, the early 2020 Democratic voters, oh man, this chapter is for me. Democratic voters and leaders became worried that the presidential field was hopelessly crowded and that the nomination might be contested and get handed to Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who many believed would cost the party the election as well as control of the House of Representatives. Oh my God. What a sentence. Indeed, that might have happened, if the field remained crowded. No, but like if everyone fell in line behind Bernie because he was the candidate, it would just be him. With nearly a dozen candidates competing at the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, yet something stunning happened a few weeks later. Oh my God. It's the Obama phone call. I live this real life. Okay. Right after the South Carolina primary, party insiders coordinated. Oh my God. And they gaslit us back then when we were like, Obama did blah, blah, blah. Oh my God. Okay. They began endorsing former President Joe Biden in large numbers. Following Biden's strong win in South Carolina, other prominent candidates, including Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar and former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, dropped out and endorsed Biden. Yeah, I will never forgive Pete Buttigieg for that. Suddenly, the vote wasn't so split anymore. During the Super Tuesday contest held just 3 days after, I remember this. South Carolina's primary, Sanders was expected to do well given his split opposition. Instead, Biden dominated the night, winning the bulk of the contest and delegates. Within a few days, nearly all the remaining candidates had dropped out of the contest, and Biden was the presumptive nominee. Damn. Flashbacks. I'm getting war flashbacks. Oh man, yeah, it was bad. And this was in 2020 when the pandemic was happening. The party had escaped what it saw as a potential catastrophic election outcome by coordinating around one candidate and pushing others out of the race, avoiding the sort of internal divisiveness that doomed the Republicans of 1912. Oh my God. These writers are being very presumptive. Or I'm being very biased. I don't know. This chapter is the next concern nominations. This one analyzes the nomination decisions at all levels, from the presidency to Congress to state and local offices. Chapter 10 focuses on the special nature of rules for presidential nominations, as we have noted. The power to nominate candidates is central to the purpose of the party, specifically to win elections and thereby put like-minded politicians into office. We'll look at the goals parties have and how they must trade and compromise some of those goals in the nomination process. We'll also focus on the tools parties use to pick nominees and enforce their choices once they've made them. Damn. All right. The question parties try to answer when nominating candidates. Oh, here's question number 1. Who shall we nominate? How shall we ensure the party unites behind our nominee? That's easy. Easy. The nomination battles of 1912 and 2020 illustrate that two intertwined questions that a party must answer when choosing a nominee. Republicans had a path to winning the 1912 election. Figure 9.1 compares the hypothetical situation of a single Republican, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's look at the stats. Okay. But would the Republican voters have voted for Taft, who was unpopular with many progressive Republicans? Would more conservative Republican voters have supported Roosevelt had he won the party nomination? Many Republican voters, no doubt, would have voted for their party's candidate regardless of who it was, because party labels are very useful shortcuts, or Q, for most voters. I thought that was heuristics. Either Taft or Roosevelt likely would have beaten Wilson, but it's hard to know which Republican would have done better in those cases. But we know that both of them running produced a major loss for the party. Even if Roosevelt and his backers believed Taft was more likely to beat Wilson in the general election, it's possible that they would have still wanted to bolt the party. Winning elections is one purpose of a political party, but as we have noted, it is not the only purpose. Partisans want to win elections so they can enact policy, and the policies that Taft would have supported were not progressive enough for the progressives. The ideological cleavage in the Republican Party in 1912 was unusually large by modern standards. The current day difference between, say, progressive Democrats like AOC and more moderate Democrats like Joe Biden in 2020 are nothing compared to the differences Taft and Roosevelt a century earlier. Wow. I didn't know AOC was considered a progressive Democrat. I thought she was a Justice Democrat or a DSA, Democratic Socialist of America. All right, whatever. The trade-off between the two considerations of electability and enacting policy is at the heart of the first question parties face. Whom shall we nominate? On the one hand, since the party cares about holding office, winning the general election is important. The party should choose a candidate who has the best chance of winning. On the other hand, if the candidate does not win office, if the candidate does win office, they get to govern. If the party cares about how they will govern, they will want to nominate a candidate whose policy preferences are in line with the party. I remember back in 2016, people were like, Bernie Sanders not even a Democrat. Why is he running in the Democrat primary? And it's like, bro, where else is he going to run? There's no independent primary. Well, not that I know of, but whatever. It's a two-party system here. The election of 1912 is even more illustrative of the second question. How shall we ensure that our party unites behind our nominee? Even before Taft was nominated, Roosevelt instructed his supporters to bolt the party. Indeed, Roosevelt had been contemplating a third-party run for some time. The battle between Taft and Roosevelt leading up to the convention had been fierce. The convention, we shall see, is designed to resolve these conflicts with the party uniting behind one nominee. But institutions, like conventions, require that people respect them. The convention lacked the ability to prevent Roosevelt's supporters from leaving and forming their own party. Indeed, in a free country, informal organizations like parties will never be able to force members to remain loyal, and so other incentives were needed. Posing the nomination decision in this way is a departure from the way many journalists and political commentators treat nominations. Rather than asking, what does it take for a candidate to get the nomination, we ask, what kind of nominee will the party choose? Damn, that's so true. We should be asking, what kind of person do we want to nominate? Instead, we should be asking which person best fits our ideology, I guess. But instead, we're picking someone on what we think the voters' ideology will be. At least that's what I'm thinking. Both perspectives are valid. Ambitious politicians who want to gain higher office must win a party's nomination, and it is reasonable to think that they can do to win it. But we think it is important to put the emphasis on the party that is doing the choosing rather than on the candidates who are being chosen. All right, we have another graph on the Roosevelt-Taft vote. Once we make this shift, all of the strategies candidates use to win nominations are reframed in terms of what the parties are looking for. Commentators sometimes describe primary elections like the early rounds of a sports competition. Candidates face off in the primaries, and the two best campaigners emerge for the final showdown. But this is misleading. The party creates political institutions to choose a nominee with the general election in mind. Yeah, because that was a big debate. Joe Biden's going to do better against Trump than Bernie Sanders would, so that's why we should just pick Joe Biden. And that's what they did. Where there are primaries, the form of the game may look a lot like the general election, but the goals of the players are not the same. Party leaders care about who will be the best representative of the party. Imagine if Major League Baseball let the National League and American League choose whichever team they wanted to play in the World Series. It's a sports joke I do not get. Oh, the Black Sox. The two leagues might set up an internal playoff, but the league's leaders might also try to influence the outcome of those games to favor the team that best represents the values of the league. Oh, okay, so like you're going to choose, I'm not even going to get into this. And who was believed to have the best chance of winning the World Series. Oh, instead of having each divisions, I guess, fight out amongst themselves who is the best baseball team, it would be like the owners being like, no, we're not gonna have a competition. We just know that this baseball team named Joe Biden is gonna beat the baseball team named Trump. That's crazy. We shouldn't be looking that ahead. Similarly, party leaders care about more than who can win the most votes in the primary. They want the best candidate for the general election, which is a different consideration. Many apparently puzzling features of nomination politics became clear when they are viewed by what the party wants rather than how the candidates themselves behave. As we argued in Chapter 1, a party has two objectives. Party members want their candidates to win elections, and they want to implement the party's policy goals. Thus, the best candidate for their policy goal is the one who can also win election. These objectives are tightly intertwined, but they can also be at odds with one another. Let's start by examining how parties attempt to find the ideal nominee. Well, I guess if the leaders just want the one person, they're just going to do whatever they can to get that one person. Assuming the party didn't need to worry about winning the general election, whom would they nominate? In general, they would want the person to be ideologically correct, acceptable to all factions, and loyal to the party. First, the party wants a candidate whose policy preferences are in line with the party's. In an ideological era, such as today, there is an ideological test. Conservative Republicans who complain about rhinos, oh my God, I can't believe this is in a textbook already. Just barely learned about this term like a couple years ago. So rhinos stands for Republicans in name only, are making the case that these co-partisans are not conservative enough. They aren't true Republicans. Why work to elect a candidate who doesn't agree with you? But both party coalitions are more than just ideology. Even a less polarized era, party leaders cared about the policy position of the candidates. The parties and the candidates were more ideologically diverse, and each party had its share of liberals and conservatives, civil rights advocates, and white supremacists. So it was just a lot more complicated to balance such a range of policy positions. Figuring out who was the best candidate to speak for all of the ideological factions within a party was no small feat. And there were quite a few candidates who wanted to take no stance on anything at all to avoid making enemies. Yeah. Kamala Harris. This is why I'm sorry, no hate against her. This is why, as we noted in Chapter 8, so many candidates are drawn from the ranks of activists. Activists are effectively choosing one of their own to be nominated, and they know they can count on such people to fight for the policies the party supports. The problem can be more difficult when the party is more ideologically diverse. The House Progressive Caucus wants ideologically pure candidates, but many in the Democratic Party would prefer more moderates. But even establishment Democrats genuinely want liberal candidates, not just as liberal as many activists would like. Nearly all Democrats would agree that they would like people who are more liberal than any Republican. Compare the conflict Republicans face today to those endured in the party when Roosevelt and Taft were competing. Roosevelt was championing a progressive agenda, which would include increased government involvement in the economy, particularly to break up business monopolies. The progressive ideology didn't have a party, and in fact had support in both major parties. Taft himself was often aligned with progressives on trade policy, and he had been instrumental in bringing about the progressive policy goal of an income tax with the 16th Amendment. Still, few would disagree that the Taft wing of the party was the more conservative wing, while Roosevelt supporters wanted to move the party to a more progressive direction. On a dimension of most to least progressive, Roosevelt and Taft were far enough apart that their Democratic opponent, Wilson, was surely in the middle between them. In such a case, it is not hard to see why Republican Party activists wanting an ideal candidate would disagree deeply over Taft versus Roosevelt. Modern ideological divisions within political parties pale in comparison. In 2008, Obama and Clinton both sought the Democratic Party nomination. Policy differences between the two frontrunners were so minimal that the debates turned on a matter of style and personality. The key difference in their constituents in the primary came down to their personal characteristics. Clinton voters were older and more likely to be women. Obama's were younger and more likely to be black. In 2016, the policy differences between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were greater than those between Clinton and Obama in 2008, but were still relatively minimal. In almost all cases, the more moderate Clinton sought to move policy in the same direction as Sanders, not just as a necessity as far or as fast. Just not necessarily as far or as fast. The biggest difference between them was their priorities and strategies rather than their goals. Even in 2020, nearly all the Democratic presidential candidates agreed on the basic goal, such as Trump's impeachment, the expansion of health insurance, and the enactment of strong environmental regulations. Their largest disagreements were about the speed in which to pursue those goals, the willingness to compromise to achieve them, and how far to take reforms. We do not wish to dismiss these differences. They are real, but they are minor compared to the divisions that both parties have faced historically. And yet, even these relatively minor divisions play a significant role in dividing the party today. Yeah, that's 100%. Acceptable to all factions. Nominating one of your own is an excellent way to ensure that candidates believe what you believe, but it is not always possible, especially when party coalitions are complicated. Parties usually consist of many different factions who don't always see eye to eye on candidates or policies. So in addition to being ideologically correct, parties also want to nominate candidates who are acceptable to all factions. Abraham Lincoln articulated this consideration in a letter he wrote to supporter Samuel Galloway in 1860 when he was strategizing his campaign for the Republican nomination. Lincoln recognized that he was probably not the first choice of a great many, but he thought that he would be acceptable to most factions so long as his supporters would give offense to no one. Oh my God, we're not going to read this this letter from Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's strategy has been employed again and again. In the middle of the 20th century, when the New Deal coalition of the Democratic Party included Southern conservatives and Northern liberals, candidates had to be acceptable to both factions. The New Deal coalition was held together largely by the commitment of Southern Democrats to acquiesce. What does acquiesce mean? Like, yeah, okay, whatever. Probably, obtain. Democrats to acquiesce on labor and economic issues, and the agreement from Northern Democrats not to press for civil rights. This tension required presidential candidates to have appeal in both parties of the country. Even as late as 1990s, the Democrats have often nominated Southerners for president. When they didn't, the vice presidential nominee has often been a Southern Democrat. The consideration helps us explain why many presidential hopefuls visit various organizations, especially those that they might not otherwise be that related to. Since about 2010, likely Republican presidential candidates have made appearances at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. Everyone knows CPAC. It's such a crazy event. Every year. Republicans also appear before the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Oh, yeah. And we'll actually mention the Heritage Foundation. Family Research Council's Value Voters Summit. These events are especially important for candidates who worry that they are perceived as too moderate, as they need to demonstrate that they are acceptable to all factions of the party. In this case, the more conservative factions. Democrats, too, make the rounds of important groups within their party, but instead of appearing at annual meetings of conservatives, religious, and business groups, they address groups affiliated with the Democratic Party, such as labor unions, environmental groups, civil rights organizations, gun control advocates. Oh, here's a picture of Joe Biden. Hold on, sorry, my chat went away. There we go. Okay. Candidates often make speeches or public appearances that are targeted to skeptical factions. Early in the 2012 nomination cycle, Mitt Romney gave a much-hyped speech at the University of Michigan on healthcare. When he was governor of Massachusetts, 2003 to 2007, Romney enacted a healthcare plan that is now widely seen as a model for the Affordable Care Act passed by Democrats and signed by President Obama in 2010. Republicans who wanted to make a tax on Obama's care as a centerpiece of the 2012 election and who wanted to see the law repealed were concerned about Romney's support for a similar law. The governor tried to quell those concerns by arguing that what he did in Massachusetts would not work at the national level. Wow, what a way to sell yourself short, buddy. In the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination cycle, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg was having difficulties winning support from African American voters. Bro, I remember this so well. Yeah, and honestly, African Americans still don't like Pete Buttigieg. And it's not because he's gay. It's because he did not do for Black people in South Bend. Okay, some of these challenges stemmed from his experiences early as his tenure in mayor, during which he fired the city's first African-American police chief. To reach out to this community, Buttigieg deployed surrogate speakers such as Congressional Black Caucus member Anthony Brown to court Black voters in South Carolina prior to the state's primary. He also proposed an educational plan focused on diversifying the teaching workforce and supporting historically Black colleges and universities. These efforts didn't bear much electoral fruit for Buttigieg, but showed the efforts a candidate will take to win over a skeptical group. While these events may have a fundraising component, the main goal is winning broad support within the party. In their analysis of presidential nominations, Marty Cohen, David Carroll, Hans Noel, and John Zahler collected data on endorsements from other politicians in every nomination contest from 1980 to 2004. They broke down those endorsements into two categories: those that come from the candidate's natural constituency, such as religious groups for a religious candidate, African American politicians for Black candidates, and those that come from outside the constituency, for example, a Democratic Socialist backing a centrist Democrat, feminist leaders backing a male candidate. Interesting. Candidates who also have the most endorsement tend to win. See this on chapter 10, next chapter. But as this research has shown, this relationship is strongest for those candidates who have the most endorsements from groups outside their native constituency. Loyal to the party. Party leaders worry about a third factor as well. They need a loyal candidate. Note that this is not precisely the same thing as being ideologically correct. One can hold the right set of beliefs but still be damaging to the party. The challenges of finding a loyal candidate were demonstrated in the career of Senator Estes Kefauver, a Democrat from Tennessee in the mid-20th century. Kefauver regularly sought his party's nomination for the presidency, but never got it. Kefauver was liberal on civil rights, so Southerners didn't trust him, but Northern Democrats also didn't trust him because his crusade against mafia corruption sometimes exposed urban politicians' ties to organized crime. Wow. Chicago. Windy City. No, I'm kidding. As a Democratic Party boss in the 1950s explained it to journalist T.H. White. Kefauver, look, let me explain in the terms of my own governor. When I decided to nominate him, I called him in and said, "Today, I'm the boss. But when I nominate you and you're elected, you'll be the boss because you're the governor. I'm putting a gun in your hand and you can shoot me with it." Now, you see, with Kefauver, you could never be sure he wouldn't take that gun, turn around, and shoot you. The urban boss is expressing a concern that is related to being unacceptable to all factions. The problem for Northern Democrats with Kefauver was not that he was ideologically impure. They actually mostly agreed with him. The problem was they didn't trust the candidate to avoid collateral damage on his own side. Fighting organized crime is one thing. Fighting it in a way that exposes your allies is another. Wow. Shake my head. Oh my God. Arizona Senator, God bless John McCain, rest in peace, had a similar problem when he ran for the Republican nomination against George W. Bush in 2000. McCain had championed campaign finance reform in a way that threatened a perceived Republican advantage. Wow. McCain also spoke out against the religious right, proving that he was not acceptable to all factions. McCain then spent the next 8 years working to prove that he would not betray Republicans before he won the nomination in 2008. And even then, I don't think they trusted him completely, because that's when we had to get Sarah Palin to get him on that side. This has also been a persistent constraint on Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential ambitions. Although a declared independent in the Senate, he has sought the Democratic Party presidential nomination twice. His policy stance are at the left of what Democrats support, but hardly outside it. Yes, 100% yes. Universal health care, that's all I can say. Rather, many Democrat leaders and activists have had difficulty supporting him because they were not sure he was loyal to the party, and those concerns were fueled by Sanders' own statements of distrust about the party's leadership. Come on. Come on. As we can see, all three of these considerations that party leaders face, finding a nominee who is ideologically correct, acceptable to all factions, and loyal to the party are potentially controversial. What is ideologically correct for one party leader may be less appealing to another. One candidate who is acceptable to all factions might still be less loved by some than another who is also broadly acceptable. And some factions might have more restrictive litmus tests than others. Loyalty, too, is a judgment call. Different party leaders may trade off those considerations differently. I wonder what Donald Trump bases all his things on. All right, electability. Oh, man. F this electability debate. If I never have to hear this ever again, I will be so happy, but it's always going to be, because we're always going to do primaries based on what the main election is going to look like. All right. In this last section, we talked about who the party would nominate if they could simply pick their ideal candidate. But of course, their ideal candidate might not get elected. That is, even if the party leaders could agree on who meets their criteria for perfection, or those criteria, or what those criteria even are. That candidates still need to beat the other party's candidate. They should not be and will not naively nominate a favorite without considering electability. This too involves multiple factors. I swear to God, if we have to be like, we need to, not too extreme. Bernie Sanders was not too extreme. I'm saying it right now. Fight me in the comments. The simplest expectation for an electable candidate is that they be ideologically moderate enough to appeal to the general electorate. As we discussed in Chapter 3, political scientists sometimes use a spatial model to understand election dynamics. In elections, the model suggests that parties will want to run a moderate candidate, close to the preferences of the median voter. The simple version of the spatial model does not account for parties having preferences over policy, however. A candidate who just wants to win will appeal to the median voter, but a candidate who also cares about policy may not want to move that close to the center. But even if parties care about policy, they will still need to think about the median. The result is a compromise candidate, not as moderate as the median voter, but not as extreme as the typical activist. This tension creates a potential conflict within the party. Some activists, especially those who want more extreme policies, will put more weight on ideological purity than other activists and candidates themselves who are more concerned about electability. This consideration was likely a big part of the appeal of Bill Clinton when the Arkansas governor considered running for the presidential nomination. Clinton had a history with the Center Democrat Leadership Council, staking himself out as a moderate. He actually spent a good bit of time trying to convince Democrats that he was not too moderate, acknowledging party leaders' desires to nominate someone who is ideologically correct. But once they knew he was still on their ideological side, a lot of party leaders found Clinton's moderate appealing because they thought that made him more electable. Is this what they call triangulation? Compared to Tim Harkin, for instance, Clinton was less liberal, particularly on labor union issues. Hell yeah. I said, oh man, Bill Clinton, NAFTA. That's all you have to know, NAFTA. But many labor unions favored Clinton over Harkin. One leader of the AFSCME union told political scientist Taylor E. Dark, "We believe that we need to be about winning in 1992. If we went for Harkin, we probably could get 90% of our agenda. If we went for Clinton, we probably could get 85% of our agenda. But it's Clinton who, in my opinion, can get us the White House." Interesting. The dynamic was also evident in the 2012 election. Republican Mitt Romney, former governor and of the relatively liberal state of Massachusetts, had spent several years convincing Republicans that he was a true conservative. Having held positions in line with Massachusetts voters on abortion and healthcare, he was pushing back against his flip-flop label and had largely succeeded. Going into the first debate against incumbent Barack Obama, Romney was viewed as a conservative. In the debate, however, he quickly tacked back to the middle, so much that he even seemed to throw Obama off. And indeed, while Romney had managed to convince many conservatives that he was ideologically acceptable, he had not taken extreme positions on many issues. It is not possible for a candidate to be completely flexible ideological, but Romney showed that it's possible to find a balance. Yeah, Romney, I don't know how to feel about Romney. I still don't like the binders full of women comment. Trying to compromise too much. All right. We saw these dynamics clearly in the intense Democratic nomination contest of 2020. Haunts me. Democratic voters were unusually fixated on electability that year. Yes. Why were they unusually fixated on that when literally Donald Trump was going to lose anyways because how he handled COVID? That he was going to lose. Every incumbent lost. We should have just picked someone who was, more focused on Democrats' ideological positions. But no, we went with electability. Joe Biden, who ended up losing the second, losing a second term, or letting Trump have a second term. Okay. According to surveys, and they were willing to nominate a presidential candidate with whom they strongly disagreed if it meant that person would defeat Donald Trump in November. Throughout the contest, Joe Biden's most effective selling point was polling that showed him as the strongest challenger to Trump. I don't know about that. I feel like around that time, there was a lot of polling that was saying that Bernie Sanders would be the most effective challenger against Trump, but I may be wrong. I'm just going based off of my history, my memories. Ultimately, many prominent Democrats, including those who had strong policy disagreements with Biden, endorsed him as the best chance for the party. Of course, because what were we going to do? Freaking Bernie was getting attacked by Hillary Clinton, saying that Hillary Clinton lost against Trump in 2016 because Bernie supporters went and voted for Trump. Hate that. Another example that illustrates how parties recalculate the balance of ideology and electability comes from the state of Colorado, which has recently shifted from a safe Republican state to a competitive one that leans Democratic in presidential years. In 2006, the Democratic Party believed it could win the governor's office only with a moderate nominee. Party insiders rallied behind Bill Ritter, the former district attorney for Denver, who had solid Democrat credentials but pro-life stance on abortion. Democrats rarely perceived Ritter to be about as liberal a Democrat they could nominate, yet still win a statewide election. Ritter, however, ended up beating his Republican opponent by a solid 15-point margin in 2006, and Democrats made further gains in their control of the state legislature. This convinced party activists that they could nominate somewhat more extreme candidates and still win statewide. When Ritter declined to run for re-election in 2010, the party nominated John Hickenlooper, this guy, for governor and Michael Bennet for a full term as U.S. Senator. but both had more traditional Democratic stance, including pro-choice beliefs, and both won. In 2018, Colorado Democrats nominated Jairus Polis for governor, who was not only well to Hickenlooper's left, but would also become the state's first openly gay chief executive. Oh no, not the political science toolkit part. Spatial model. Part 4, elections. In Chapter 3, we introduced the spatial model, a tool political scientists use to understand how changes in policies offered can affect outcomes. There we discuss how different legislators might choose different policies in a legislator. The same tool can be applied to elections. There, the party and the voters are both choosing among candidates. In this figure, we treat the dimension as simply liberalism versus conservatism. Each party needs to choose a nominee. Both want to win. Both also want a candidate who will give them what they want if they do win. Then the voters choose from those two candidates. The choice of candidates includes the choice of where the candidate is on that space. Each party can choose a moderate or an extremist or someone in between. And the outcome of the election depends not only on their choice, but on the choice of the other party. In the example below, Democrats chose someone who is very liberal, and Republicans chose someone only somewhat conservative. The result is that the Republican wins. Oh, okay, because it's closer to the median voter. If, however, the Democrats choose someone who is very moderate, while the Republicans continue to hold that somewhat conservative position, then the Democrats would win. Okay. In both of the above examples, notice that the median voter votes for the winner, just as in Chapter 3. The median voter is central in this framework. The logic suggests that both parties should nominate someone who is a centrist and compete for the median voter's vote. Economist Anthony Downs explains this outcome, in which both parties nominated moderates in his classical 1954 book, An Economic Theory of Democracy, which applies the spatial model to elections. In the real world, this basically never happens, even as Downs acknowledged. Nevertheless, this does explain why the parties tend to avoid nominating extremists. It also explains why the most conservative Democrats run in conservative districts, while the most liberal Republicans run in liberal districts. Why don't the parties nominate a perfect moderate? There are a number of I feel like this is a typo. There are a number of reasons as why we have noted elsewhere. Many voters chose candidates on the basis of other factors, including the state of the economy. It's the economy, stupid, and other aspects of political environment. They might vote for a more extreme candidate when other factors are in play. Ronald Reagan, for example, was likely the most extreme candidate when he challenged President Jimmy Carter in 1980. But the flagging economy and several foreign policy challenges weighed heavy on voters' mind, leading them to deny Carter a second term. It is also possible that voters may be misinformed about the policy preferences of the candidate. And moderate voters are less likely to vote, but ideologically more extreme voters might be less likely to vote if the candidate is too moderate. I wonder if that's what we had in 2024. Sorry, I had to open a can of soda. In 2024, when people were like, Kamala Harris is too moderate. She's not taking a position on, she's taking a moderate position on war, maybe even a conservative position on war, and she's not as progressive as a lot of Democrats would have liked on the Israel-Palestine issue. So yeah, interesting. And she still didn't win. All of these factors make it possible for the candidate who is further away from the median voter to still win. Also, I don't think Donald Trump was a moderate candidate. He was extreme, right? But there are limits on just how far candidates can stray from the median voter. When parties have nominated truly extreme candidates, such as Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964 and Democrat George McGovern in 1972, they have lost bigly. I mean, they lost big. So it is probably still true that the probability of a win increases as the party candidates get closer to the median voter. Why don't parties maximize those chances? The main reason is that parties also care about who they win with, and that too can be seen in the spatial model. The problem is what makes party activists happy is usually the opposite of what gets politicians elected. Most activists want more ideologically extreme candidates, so as the activists get happier, the candidate becomes less likely to win. Wow. What about in the case of Trump? Okay. Acceptable to all factions, again. No party wants to nominate a candidate who is not broadly acceptable, as we saw in the previous election, or the previous section. But broad acceptability also matters for the general election. The case of the election in 1912 is a nightmare scenario. The winner can't capture the support for those backing the loser, and then the loser decides to run as an independent. This hasn't happened at the presidential level since 1912, but it does happen from time to time in other offices. Oh my God. One high profile case came in 2006. Oh my God, I remember this. When Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman lost the Democratic primary for his seat because Joe Lieberman was a conservative. Lieberman had alienated many Democrats by voting for several conservative policies. I want to say it was for the war, bro. And choosing sides with Republican President George W. Bush over his fellow Democrats. And he was from Connecticut, bro. This is exactly the sort of disloyalty that party wants to avoid in its nominee. And so liberal Democrat Ned Lamont challenged Lieberman in his primary. A successful primary challenge against an incumbent is rare, but Lamont won, depriving Lieberman of the Democratic nomination. Lieberman then ran in the general election as an independent and won. Wow. Unlike the 1912 presidential example, the voters in Connecticut are sufficiently Democratic that the Republican nominee, Alan Schlinger, never really had a chance, but Lieberman's defection still had consequences. Lieberman had been a Democrat. The tools the Democrat Party had to ensure his loyalty were blunted now that he had proven he could win the seat without the help of the other party. True defections like Lieberman are rare, however. Yeah, I want to know, question. Hold on, let me write it in chat. Was the NYC mayoral election, what was it, last year? Election, when what's his name? When Mamdani was in the primary against Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo lost the primary vote, and he still ran as an independent against Mamdani and the other Republican candidates, I guess. I don't even remember who they were. Cuomo ran as an independent against the Democratic nominee, and he lost. That's crazy that Lieberman actually won. Let me just... Election Mamdani v. Cuomo. Okay. That's a question to ask Conroy later on. This is because even when there is potential for defection, parties manage to nominate candidates who can unite the party. Indeed, scholars have found only mixed evidence of diverse primaries hurting a candidate in the general election. A diverse primary might indicate a divided party, and the losing faction may sit on their hands in the general election. Then again, a divisive primary might indicate a robust party filled with good candidates and vibrant ideas. What should matter is whether the party can unite after the nomination process. It is easy to think of cases in which a party lost an election of lack of support from their own party. President Carter faced an organized primary challenge in 1980, a rare thing for a sitting president. He went on to lose to Ronald Reagan by almost 10 percentage points. It is tempting to say that his loss was due to the failure of Democrats to unite behind their candidate. However, Carter's loss is more than accounted for by an economic repression in the 1980s, or in 1980. His primary challenge was more likely the result of his apparent weakness going into the fall election than the cause of them. General Ford and George H.W. Bush both faced serious primary challengers when they ran in 1976 and 1992, respectively, but their general election losses those years are better explained by other factors, such as a weak economy in Ford's case and such as a weak economy and, in Ford's case, unpopular pardon of Nixon. Meanwhile, some bitterly contested nominees go on to win big, as Barack Obama did in 2008. After a close primary contest against Hillary, overall, there is no strong, consistent evidence that facing a primary challenge hurts you in the general election. What matters is whether the party pulls together to form a united front behind their nominee, and they usually do. After the hard-fought and sometimes acrimonious contest between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in 2008, the party took deliberate steps to unify behind the nominee. The party orchestrated a movement for Clinton to be the one to call for Obama's nomination. As the convention worked its way through the roll call of states, it came time to recognize New York, where Clinton stood. Rather than announce New York's vote, Clinton called Obama to be nominated by acclamation, thus very publicly supporting her former adversary. Clinton's husband also spoke in favor of Obama. That's so weird to call her Clinton's husband, because I feel like when you say Clinton, you're just talking about Bill. So even when the primary battle does not come down to the wire, the parties seek to demonstrate unity. Oh, here we go. In 2020, when Joe Biden had secured the nomination earlier in the process, the party still offered a prime speaking spot to his primary rival, Bernie Sanders, who used his platform to make the case for Biden to his supporters. Yes, 100%. I literally did what Bernie told me to do, okay? I did not vote for Bernie anywhere past the primaries. If a party does fail to hold together, the threat of what happened in 1912 looms. The breakdown of 1912 was extremely unusual. It only happened after many efforts to hold the party together failed. The risk is greatest in contests with lower stakes than the presidency. For that reason, many states have sore loser laws, which prevent a candidate who ran for the party's nomination from running as an independent in the general election. Ooh, I think New York State needs to get that. Andrew Cuomo was a big sore loser. Okay, good candidate qualities. The ideal candidate is the living embodiment of what the party stands for. Their job is to get themselves elected. Whatever else that entails, the party needs someone who is capable of running a good campaign. Running for office is grueling, with day after day public appearances and humbling fundraising. Humbling? I don't know about humbling. Campaigns put a strain on relationships. Some people are cut out for it and some are not. And some people have a more natural charisma and a more compelling personal story or other features that make them appealing to voters. In general, we think too much is often made of these personal characteristics. At the presidential level, especially, almost everyone who throws their hat in the ring has the skills needed to run for the office. Terrible candidates don't get much consideration. Commentators in the media love to talk about how one or another candidate is dull or has some other fatal flaw. After the fact, it is easy to subscribe to that kind of explanation. John Kerry lost in 2004 because he was a long-winded, overeducated elitist. John McCain lost in 2008 because he was too old and too out of touch. Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 because she was overprepared. The Donald Trump who won in 2016 was the same person who lost in 2020. Sorry, they're not blaming Donald Trump for anything. They're like, he was the same person in 2020. He just lost because of the pandemic. Okay, we find these narratives flawed, as we have noted repeatedly. Presidential elections are largely decided on the basis of fundamentals, such as the state of the economy. Had he been elected, John McCain would have been less than 3 years older than Ronald Reagan, who was when he won. And to his detractors, at least Barack Obama is every bit as elitist as John Kerry was. Yeah. Even if we don't think that campaigning skills is the most decisive candidate trait, it is important. At the presidential level, pretty much everyone is a good campaigner. For lower office, it is important to nominate candidates who compete well. Probably the first consideration is fundraising ability. For local candidates attempting to get their party's support, demonstrating the ability to raise money independently can show that they have the skills to run for office and will use party money wisely. But parties will also prefer candidates who are comfortable in campaign settings. Whew. Okay, hopefully not much more to go. My throat is going. Solving the second nomination. Oh, crap. I think we're coming into question number 2. Assume the party doesn't care about winning. What are the 3 things they'd want in a nominee? Or did we already pass that? Let's go. The previous section outlined the kind of candidate the party would want. Oh, whoops. But as we saw, some qualities the party would like to maximize are at odds with other qualities. For example, someone who is ideologically correct might not be acceptable to all factions. Thus, different activists within the party will favor different candidates. We saw this in the election of 1824. See Chapter 2. 4 candidates ran as Democratic Republicans, each chosen through a separate mechanism. To avoid chaos and the resulting electoral losses, parties needed what Nelson Polsby called coalition forcing institutions. Yeah, I hope the book talks about the Obama coalition. To help them come to a conclusion on which nominee they will support. The party has a number of options in the institutions it uses to choose nominees. As E.E. Schattschneider, I'm so sorry, Schattschneider puts it, I'm just going to say Schneider's Pretzels. Schattschneider. I can't. I'm not German, bro. What matters is whether the nomination is binding, whether it effectively commits the whole party to support it. The nomination may be made by congressional caucus, a delegate convention, a mass meeting, a cabal, an individual, or a party election. The test is, does it bind? Not how was it done. Next, we look at some of the different ways American political party nominates candidates for office. Sorry, I need to figure out a question. Assuming the party doesn't care about winning, what 3 things would they want in a nominee? We need to go back to the previous section, I think, to answer that. What 3 things? I guess campaign skills? Okay. The ideal candidate living party to get themselves elected. Capable of running a good campaign? Is that the first one? Capable of running a good campaign. And then 2, running for office, campaign puts strain on race relationship, blah, blah, blah. As presidential, everyone who throws their hat in the reins needs a skill to run for office. Terrible candidates, commentators, and blah, blah, blah. I don't know if this is the answer to number 2. That's okay. Capable of running a good campaign. Even if we don't think campaign skills are the most decisive, candidate is important for everyone. Good campaigner. Okay, we already got that. Probably the first consideration is fundraising ability. Okay. For local candidates attempting to get their raise money. Hold on. Maybe that might be fundraising capability. And then what could the third one be? What the party stands for. Their job is to get themselves elected, whatever that entails. The party needs someone who is capable of running a good campaign. Oh, wait, let me see what this section says. Acceptable to all factions? Would that be the third one? Well, no, wait. The question is, assuming the party doesn't care about winning. Oh. But wait, these are things that care about winning. Okay, whatever. We'll scratch that. We'll get back to number 2. Okay. Here we go. Solving the second nomination question. Uniting behind a nominee. The previous section outlined the kind of candidate a party would want. But as we saw, some qualities parties would like to maximize are at odds with others. Oh, did we already read this? Yeah, sorry. Oh yeah, because there's a Schlatt and Schleider. The most effective way for a party to choose its nominees is for party leadership to meet, discuss likely candidates, and then choose among them, especially in local contexts. The party leadership might gather to draw up a slate of candidates for the next election. They would not confer with voters in the process. In some cases, a single party leader might have a final say. Oh no. In Mayor Richard J. Daley's Chicago's 1960, the Committee of the Democratic Ward leaders put together slates, but as journalist Mike Ryoko put in his account of Daley's machine boss, even the slate makers do not kid themselves into thinking they are deciding who the candidates will be. They listen to the applicants, push their favorites, and wait for Chairman Daley to make up his mind. The advantage of centralized decision-making process, be it selected committees or one powerful leader, is in coordinating many offices. In its effort to appeal to all factions, the party leader might work out a log roll across multiple offices. A Latino politician for this position, a business leader for that one, a Christian conservative for the other one. A central committee or a boss can also ensure that some inexperienced candidates are groomed for future success, as one Chicago ward boss told Ryoko. Daley moves us around like a bunch of chess pieces. I think his idea is to slate people who aren't going to try to rival him or add to someone else's strength. Look at how Cullerton got to be assessor. First, he was a nothing alderman. He was a real nothing. Okay, but aldermen are important in the city of Chicago. But Daley put him in as finance chairman so he could have somebody who wouldn't get out of line. Then put him in as assessor. Keeney wanted assessor for his brother George. George would have loved it. Funny how people love to be assessor. Ha! But Daley wasn't about to give Tom Keeney the assessor's office, so he looked around and there was the faithful parquet cooler. Okay, so it's just giving positions. This kind of control comes at a cost, of course. For one, it takes particularly brilliant political minds to play multi-dimensional chess like Daley was doing. Systems that are open to more people permit more people to share their knowledge and wisdom. For another, politicians who are locked out of the candidate choosing process may get frustrated. If a system does not allow ambitious politicians an opportunity to try to break in, those ambitious politicians may start looking for other ways to advance their cause. If the party leaders themselves don't consider reform to accommodate them, they may find reforms thrust upon them. Okay. The Legislative Caucus. Since political parties do much for their activity in the legislature, it is naturally to think of the party members in the legislature as representing the party more broadly. Early in U.S. history, a caucus of party members in the Congress would meet to decide who would represent their party in the general election. As we saw in Chapter 2, the election of 1796 was the first two-party election for president. The nascent anti-federalist faction had already decided informally to back Thomas Jefferson for president. They decided on Aaron Burr as their vice presidential candidate at a meeting of members of their party in Congress. Meanwhile, the Federalists settled on John Adams and Thomas Pinckney in the same way. Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that in Chapter 2. Both parties used that method until the election of 1824 when the system broke down. The Congressional Caucus is a flawed method of party nomination because it is restrictive to those who are in the legislature. If a party lost big in earlier elections, there may be a few members of that party to meet in the caucus. The office holder in the legislature may also be poor representation of all the factions in that party. Office holders tend to be more interested in holding office than achieving policy goals. Thus, the caucus may not satisfy some of the party's criteria that we have described. There was a problem in 1824. Many Democrat Republicans felt that the Congressional Caucus didn't represent the rest of the party. Only members of Congress could participate, and even many in that body felt it was inappropriate for that reason. A minority of congressional Democrat Republicans in Congress did meet as a caucus to nominate William Crawford. Meanwhile, state legislature caucuses in Massachusetts, Kentucky, and Tennessee nominated favorite son candidate John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson, respectively. The outcome was clearly unsatisfactory, so the National Legislative Caucus was abandoned as a way to nominate candidates. Oh my God, and here we get to conventions. After the 1824 election, the supporters of Andrew Jackson realized that part of the problem was failure to coordinate on nominations. In 1825, the Tennessee legislature nominated Jackson for the presidency for the 1828 election, and the shadow of failure to coordinate in 1824 kept other candidates out of the race. Jackson won. For 1832, the supporters of Jackson, now coalescing as the Democratic Party, formally organized a convention to renominate Jackson and nominate a vice president. Conventions have many similarities to legislative caucuses. A select group of party loyalists gather and deliberate. The difference is that the convention is made up of party members who were not elected to Congress and who may not have interest in holding office themselves. From 1832 to 1968, the National Party Convention developed a format that we would find quite familiar nowadays. Although the proceedings of those conventions were a good deal more consequential than those of today. Delegates from across the country would meet every 4 years to argue about the strengths and weaknesses of various candidates, hold a series of votes, and ultimately pick a presidential and vice presidential nominee. Importantly, during that era, the presidential nominee was chosen at the convention. It was quite common for attendees and outside observers to have no idea whom the party would nominate before the convention began. As discussed in Chapter 7 and 10, however, the party nomination system changed after 1968, and now the choice of nominations is a foregone conclusion by the opening of the day of the party conventions. The major parties' national conventions typically take place after the primary and the caucuses and the last 4 days in the late summer of the election year. Their primary purpose is to nominate a candidate for president and for vice president. The convention also craft and vote on a platform, a statement of what the party stands for, and activists have an opportunity to meet and network with some other politicos from around the country. Since conventions are televised, they provide an opportunity to promote the party and its nominee to the country. The parties in the states also hold conventions, which do similar things, including nominate candidates for state-level office. State conventions also sometimes choose delegates for the national convention. While the result of the national convention are usually predetermined, the state conventions are not. States use conventions because, as a tool for nominating candidates, conventions are very effective. All the stakeholders in the party could be present, and they can negotiate directly with one another. So if a candidate who is acceptable to all factions exists, they have a good chance to emerge. The trade-off between ideological purity and electability enhancing moderation can be hashed out face to face. In their discussion of national party conventions of the 1960s, political scientists Nelson Polsby and Aaron Wildesky described the drama that played out between pragmatists who were more interested in a candidate who can win and purists who were more interested in policy. Most conflicts are not resolved, though, on the convention floor. Important party leaders whose advice and instruction will be heeded by other delegates can strategize and coordinate in private. In 1920, a reporter used the term smoke-filled room to describe the room at the Blackstone Hotel where Republican power brokers negotiated their party's nominee during the convention in Chicago. They settled on Warren G. Harding. Those smoke-filled rooms are no longer the setting of important decisions at the national conventions, as well as we will show in Chapter 10, but such bargaining remains important at state conventions. The advantage of a convention over a legislative caucus is that it can be open to all elements of the party, even those who might not have won election in the legislature. This opens new ground for party factions to compete. Yet important questions remain, like who gets to come to the convention? Convention delegates are selected in a variety of ways, almost as varied as the ways in which candidates are nominated. A faction, especially one interested in nominating its own candidates, can coordinate to send delegates from across the state. The institution of the convention enabled the nomination of the Tea Party Republican Ken Cuccinelli. Ken Cuccinelli. I'm being Fredophobic, for governor of Virginia in 2013. Cuccinelli planned to run against incumbent Lieutenant Bill Bolling for the gubernatorial nomination in a primary. Bolling had expected to run for nomination unopposed. The state Central Committee decided to switch to a convention on the grounds that Democrats couldn't participate in the convention, but could vote in the primary. The convention was filled with more conservative Republicans, many self-identifying with the Tea Party, anticipating the outcome of the convention. Anticipating the outcome of the convention, Bolling dropped out and Cuccinelli became the nominee, although he lost the general election to Democrat Terry McAuliffe. Primaries and caucuses. Probably the most common method for a party to select a nominee today is a primary. Candidates register to compete in the primary, and then voters affiliated with that party vote. The candidate with a plurality of the vote will represent that party in the general election. Progressive reformers of the early 20th century advocate primaries because they wanted to keep the choice of candidates out of the hands of party leaders. The compromises that we have described in the previous section as central to the party's decision, such as ideological correctness, acceptability to different factions, were exactly the sort of things progressives didn't like. At the same time, some party leaders found primaries appealing since they were a route around the intra-party conflict that could bubble up at a convention. In many ways, progressive reformers got their way. Primaries do take the decision of who to nominate out of the hands of party leaders and put it in the hands of voters. But which voters? ? Exactly how primaries work depends on a great deal of how they are implemented. There are at least 5 different kinds of primaries, each with their own consequences. Political scientists do not agree on the precise definition of those kinds of primaries, but they do agree that there is a range of how restrictive the primary is as to who it allows to participate. All right, closed primaries. The most restrictive model of a primary is a closed primary, meaning the contest is limited to those who are registered members of the party. Voters must typically register to vote as members of a party long before the primary itself. Closed primaries are thought to be preferred by party leaders, but because only party-loyal voters participate. The party is thus not vulnerable to meddling voters from another party, or those who are otherwise not interested in helping the party elect the best candidate who can win. Semi-closed primaries. While closed primaries are restrictive to registered voters, some states have primaries where unaffiliated voters can choose on election day which party primary to vote in, but those already registered with a party cannot change that status on election day. These primaries are called semi-closed primaries. So a registered Democrat cannot cross over to meddle with the Republican nominations, but an independent voter can easily switch allegiances. Typically, the voter must register with their new party and thus will remain registered with that party for the future unless they later make the effort to change their registration. Okay. Open primaries. An open primary is open to any registered voter, but typically a voter may still only vote in one primary at a time. So a registered Republican can decide to vote in the Democratic primary, but if they do, they will have to choose among Democrats for every office. An open primary is, in theory, subject to strategic crossover voting, or party raiding, where voters from the other party try to sabotage their opponents by voting for a weak candidate. While this is technically possible, there is little evidence that this happens often or that it actually affects the outcomes. Okay, all right, so maybe Ezra Klein is okay in thinking that open primaries is a good idea. Blanket primaries. The least restrictive form of primary is a blanket primary in which voters may choose which primary to participate in. Each primary still pits candidates of the same party against each other, and each party then has a single candidate. For example, in a blanket primary, a voter can vote for a Republican candidate for one office and a Democratic candidate for another. Interesting. Political parties are particularly frustrated with blanket primaries. In 1996, after California imposed the system through a referendum, the party sued the state, claiming that allowing anyone to access the party's nominations infringes upon the party's right to association. the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. In California Democratic Party v. Jones, the court ruled that the state could not force parties to let non-members choose their nominees for them. California would later adopt a top two or jungle primary. Oh my God, we've got to the jungle primary. That means I completely missed the second question. Okay, well, we'll just have to ask about it in class tomorrow, I think. Okay, jungle primaries or top two, a special form of blanket primary called the top two primary, the jungle primary, is used in Washington State, California, and Louisiana. It essentially does away with party primaries altogether, thus avoiding the issue in the California Democratic Party v. Jones. Instead, all candidates across all parties run against one another in a state-run primary election. The top two candidates then face each other in the general election. So after the top two or jungle primary, the general election could have two Democrats or two Republicans running against each other. In a famous example, U.S. Representative Howard Berman and Brad Sherman, both Democrats who had been redistricted in the same district in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, ended up on the November runoff after winning the top two slots in the June 2012 primary. The runoff campaign was intense and nasty, pitting Democrat activist groups in different geographical regions against each other and nearly driving the two longtime Democratic allies into a physical fight. Sherman ultimately prevailed. Institution like the top two primary, we need to look into this Sherman thing because I do not remember that at all, and I should remember it. Sherman, and what was the other guy's name? Berman. 2012. Okay. Institutions like the top two primary are explicitly designed to take the choice of candidates out of the hands of parties. They are introduced by those who think that closed primaries are not good for democracy and so should be circumvented. However, parties maintain influence, even in places with top two primaries. In California's first election under the top two system, 2012, only 16% of state, house, and congressional races saw candidates from the same party meet in the general election. In most races, the parties still coordinated around a single candidate. They do this in part through endorsements, which signal which candidate with the party label is the real candidate from that party. Candidates endorsed by the major parties are more likely to win nominations. Caucuses. Some candidates are selected in caucuses, which are technically different from primaries, but serve similar purposes. They are mostly used for the selection of delegates to national conventions, although some caucuses also choose other nominees. A caucus is a lot like a mini convention, but at the local level, it is scheduled for a specific time, and everyone is expected to arrive at that time to take part in the discussion. The caucus might be scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, and then voters arrive and come together in one room. How much deliberation actually takes place will vary, but typically, after a few hours, the participants have registered their choices for nominees and selected delegates for conventions. We described the most famous caucus, Iowa's presidential caucus, in Chapter 10. Oh my God. One reason that reformers want to open the primary system to people beyond just registered party members is to combat polarization. Interesting. Since one of the criteria that parties have is to nominate someone who is ideologically correct on policy, it is thought that relaxing their hold on the nomination would lead more moderate nominees. This does not seem to have been the case, however. Candidates elected through open primaries or semi-closed primaries are generally no more or less moderate than those elected through the closed system. This may be in part of the other goals that party leaders have, to nominate someone electable. So when the party has its say, they can pull the candidate away from being too moderate, but they pull them in from being too extreme as well. On average, then, there is little difference. In the 2016 Democratic nomination for president, Bernie Sanders did much better among independents, while Hillary Clinton did much better among self-identified Democrats. It is not surprising then that Sanders often did better in states with open primaries, while Clinton did better in closed primaries. Even though she was likely the more moderate candidate of the two. However, an analysis at the time showed that even if all primaries had been open, it is unlikely Sanders would have been able to win the nomination. The effect is just not that large. It is also likely that even in systems that minimize the ability of the party to influence outcomes, the party finds a way. As we will see in Chapter 10, when the party leaders were shut out of formal presidential nomination processes, they got involved earlier. The same is true for other offices when the stakes are high enough. Political scientist Casey Dominguez, for example, shows that endorsements from political party leaders matter the most in nominations for open seat contests where there is no incumbent running. That makes sense. Still, the difference is not completely meaningless. Even if it is hard to find systematic differences, as we saw with the Cuccinelli race in Virginia, the decision to switch to a convention led to a different outcome than was expected under the primary. When the party leaders have more control, it is easier for them to find a candidate who meets their two criteria, and easier to enforce the candidate's selection. But it is harder for party rank and file to hold those party leaders accountable when they do. Oh my God, please tell me this is the end. And notes. Oh no, okay. How should nominations be? The change in the presidential nomination process are echoed in conflicts at all levels of government. Party nomination methods are designed to help parties choose their nominees, but party members who are shut out of those methods, as well as non-party actors, want more of a say in the process. What is the ideal system? Much of the answer to this question depends on the answer to our overriding normative question: are parties good for democracy? Oh my God, this is a completely, well, yes, I think parties are good for democracy. I don't know how else we would do it. Just look at Latin America. It is tempting to say that the cure for problems in democracy is more democracy. And so the best system is one that is open as possible with less influence from parties. In the extreme, something like a top two primary essentially removes from the parties the special control they have over nominating candidates. They are free to publicly support candidates, but anyone can run in the top two primary. Winning in that kind of primary is not winning the nomination, it is winning the first stage of a two-stage system. In such a system, parties will need to find other ways to satisfy their goals. Experience from California suggests parties may still be able to exert some influence in elections, but they may not be able to satisfy all their goals the way they used to. The lack of party influence in nominations is desirable if we think that parties are not good for democracy. Interesting. If we think, following Latin Schleider, however, that democracy requires parties, things are less clear. If parties cannot balance the desire to enact acceptable policy with the need to get elected, then candidates may either be too extreme or too fixated on elections. If they do not control nominations, parties might not be able to help hold Parties might not be able to help hold office holders accountable. At that time, just because ordinary voters have a larger role in the process in a more open system does not mean the party has lost all influence. A more open system with a party still trying to manage it may be better than closed may be better than the closed machine-run systems of the past. Oh my God, it's the end. Oh my God, no. We have to read chapter 10. I know. All right. Man, chapter 10 is gonna look real interesting. It's 2020 all over again. There's Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Amy Klobuchar. I think they cut off whoever that person was. Oh, Tom Steyer, who's running again. Ugh. All right. We're gonna have to end it. We've been streaming for almost 3 hours now. So, thank you for being with me. I wish we could have read this other opinion. Yeah, this, but you know, you're gonna have to read that on your own. It's pretty short, but yeah. So, and we almost finished listening to this, but you get the gist, right? You get the gist. So let me wish everyone a good rest of your day. Thank you for joining me on the day of my birth. I appreciate it. I'm 33 freaking years old, and we got 33 more years plus to go. So hit that subscribe button if you are not subscribed. And have a good rest of your day. Peace, everyone. I'll be back streaming later this week, maybe. No outro music. We're just gonna